ask you one thing.
All right, here we are at the Water Association annual meeting. I'm Gene Lundquist, and we're interviewing Felicia Marcus, the chair of the Water Resources Control Board. And Felicia, we're just delighted to have you down here in Kern County and Bakersfield. Tell me a little bit about what you're going to talk about.
Well, I'm going to talk about the water picture in California in terms of, I think, the inflection point we're at, and where we have some very serious challenges, and I think we have the wherewithal to meet them, but it takes everybody stepping up and figuring out how to solve the myriad pieces of the problem. It requires us using water in much more inventive ways, use it more often, and to honor the various competing uses, with agriculture being a key one that is essential for the future. As we look at what climate change is going to bring to us just a few decades from now, as the projections suggest, whether it's 2, 3, 4, or 5 decades from now, all the projections are that we're going to lose most of our snowpack. And our snowpack right now forms the backbone of the storage in this state as snow melts out and refills reservoirs and streams over the course of the spring and the summer. We had a real wake-up call about what the loss of snowpack might mean this past year. And so the way to deal with it is an all-of-the-above strategy. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that, the administration's Water Action Plan, which are our priorities for the next 4 years, but also talk hopefully about some of the bright spots where people are stepping up and making a big difference. I think the passage of the water bond being just one thing where people put aside their old battles and stepped up for the good of the state as a whole.
Well, speaking about the water bond, it just passed and it did pretty darn well.
Yeah.
What are some of the good things that were contained in the water bond?
Well, the water bond has a wealth of good opportunities, some things that we haven't seen in a water bond before. There's money for storage, there's money for integrated water management, which is one of the real significant breakthroughs of the last decade in California water. A lot of money to help local communities who have come together and can reach across different geographic as well as organizational silos to figure out how to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts in their communities. So there's a lot of money for that. There's also money for safe drinking water for the first time in large amounts to help the communities that we now know don't have the safe drinking water that most of Californians take for granted. There are 1 or 2 million people who don't have that in California, and in 2014 that is not a good thing, and so there's money to deal with that. There's also money to deal with cleaning up contaminated groundwater basins, whether from nitrates or from industrial chemicals, that'll give us an opportunity to really kickstart that effort to again make our groundwater basins more usable for conjunctive use and more efficient use of precious water in the future. There's also money in there for flood control. There's money in there for ecosystem restoration that allows us to do many of the things to help fish and wildlife other than just add water. And I think that way we can actually try and restore the ecosystems that are important not just to fish and wildlife, but to people all across this state and get ahead of the curve as opposed to having lawsuits drive our future.
You know, I've noticed in reading your biography that one of your hallmarks has been trying to bridge across gaps of opinion between environmentalists and agriculture and oil and so on. Tell me a little bit about that, because I think that's interesting and I think it's essential.
Well, I think one of the things that my odd career path, where I've worked on all sides of the water issue, different geographies, different subjects, both water quality and water supply, is that it's been humbling to actually put myself in the shoes of other people on other sides of the seeming divide and realize that we didn't need to be so divided. Many times I've been called the social worker in the environmental movement, but I really, it's not that I just want everyone to get along, it's that I really think that there are solutions there if people can reach across the aisle, so to speak, and talk about the real issues. And in the water world, for whatever reason, we don't do that nearly as much as we could. And I think my whole career seems to be based on being the most reasonable person in the room. But I for one, I care about agriculture, I care about industry, I care about the environment, I care about all of it. And I think most people do. I just think within the water world, we've developed such expertise, and folks have stayed so much in their own own silos that sometimes we miss the opportunities to work with a person across the table from us, thinking they must automatically be at odds. But I've seen people come together and really make historic breakthroughs, starting in the city of LA and then later on in the state of California and in communities all across the country.
Well, one of the things that we're proud of a lot of things here in Kern County, our groundwater basins, our water banks, and so on. And we're proud that we have already formed what we call the Kern Groundwater Authority, a joint powers authority to deal with the new groundwater law. Tell us just real briefly about the groundwater law that just passed.
Well, congratulations on that. I actually think Kern is very well positioned to be one of the first success stories out of the box, because you have such extraordinary water managers in your midst, and you're highly organized and collaborative, which is terrific. The groundwater legislation is something that there was a convergence of opinion across the spectrum of folks looking at our groundwater issues, driven for some by the fact that we're going to be losing our snowpack in a few decades, and the only thing of a size and scale that can really replace that lost snowpack as a storage medium is our groundwater basins. Also based on the fact that there were a growing number of conflicts in a variety of communities across the state where neighbor versus neighbor wells were going dry, and folks were having a hard time getting it done at a local level without either assistance from the state government or some sort of a potential hammer from the state government. And so an unusual collection of academics, nonprofits, folks in the agricultural community and local government and water districts felt that we really needed to finally do something at a state level, but rather than doing it at a top-down level, as some states do, the suggestion was to figure out how to help locals do it. And so the legislation does a number of things. It removes some barriers to counties and other entities to be able to form groundwater districts. It removes some funding barriers for such districts so that they can raise the money to support themselves. It gives a timeline, generous in some people's view and way too short in others, to both form some sort of an entity or series of entities who've agreed to deal with the subbasin, and then a series of timelines for coming up with a plan, a 20-year plan, to try and deal with getting our groundwater basins into some kind of sustainable shape. So fairly lofty goal, fairly generous time period, but we don't underestimate the fact that this is going to be a challenge for folks. And then a series of tools and technical assistance from the state, as well as a number of backstop measures where if a local entity doesn't get it together by these set timelines, the state board can step in, not to do the whole thing necessarily, but with a series of tools that escalate to some level, with the final guarantee being the state doing an interim plan, but we hope to never have to do that.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, one more question or observation. We here in Kern County believe in area of origin protections. We believe in protecting the environment, and we would like to get an adequate supply for both urban and ag down here, and the oil industry for that matter, although they don't use that much. And we thought we solved that once, when the State Water Project came in and the federal project. But now here we are this past year with a 5% allocation from the state, 0 on the Fed side, and debating the Bay Delta Conservation Program. Can we afford it? Can we afford not to do it?
Can we afford not to do it is the right
question.
So
can you comment on that whole scenario? Because we're living, obviously, by mining the aquifer right now in this unprecedented drought, and it can't go on forever.
Yeah, let's hope that the drought breaks. The recent rains are very, very welcome. We're not out of the drought by any stretch, but I'll take it. It feels so much better to have it raining this time of year rather than going through December and January and waiting for rain like we did earlier this year. So fingers crossed that we'll be out of the drought this year. And in a drought, everybody suffers. Urban, ag, fish and wildlife, you name it. So it's tough to deal with. I think we do have a challenge in this state as our population has grown tremendously. We have to keep adjusting to the times. We also are now in a time when we recognize from the state and federal laws and court decisions, and I think public support that we also need to take care of our fish and wildlife resources. That puts an additional strain on the other users of water, and so it's really up to us to come up with more innovative ways to store water above ground, below ground, off stream, on stream, big, small, but also to figure out how to use the water we use, particularly in urban California, in a much more efficient way and much more often before we dump it into the ocean in particular. There's an opportunity of a fairly vast scale to be able to use water to capture stormwater in the urban context and to conserve water so that we can take the pressure off agriculture and population growth and the other things that we know are coming at us, because we know that food security is going to be an issue in the decades to come as well, and all Californians, let alone the nation and the world, rely on agriculture in the Central Valley and the rest of California. And so it's in all of our interests to figure out how to preserve our ability to grow the healthy fruits and vegetables that the world and the state and the nation rely on.
Well, Felicia, thank you very much for this interview, and thanks again for coming to Bakersfield and Kern County for the Water Association annual meeting.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.